Ever have one of those moments, like you're teaching something and you ask any questions? Everyone looks at you all innocent, like, nope, we're good. But then later you realize they totally missed the point.
Oh, yeah. Happens all the time.
It's like the worst feeling. So this research we're diving into, it's all about how teachers can use these quick check-ins, these like informal assessments to avoid that pitfall, to really see if students are actually learning.
It's like having a little window into their brains. You can see what's actually going on in there.
Exactly. And the cool thing about the study is they didn't just like send out a survey or something. They went into real middle school science classrooms to see how these informal assessments play out in the wild.
And get this, they did it at this really unique school. It was a charter school, all project-based learning and, wait for it, co-teaching in every classroom.
Oh, hold up. 2 teachers at once. Okay, now I'm really interested. How does that even work with those quick checks for understanding?
That's the thing. It makes a huge difference. The researchers actually called them like informal formative assessments. But can we just call them informal assessments for sure?
Much easier.
Okay, so the co-teaching thing, it gave teachers more space to use these informal assessments in all sorts of cool ways.
So instead of just like a quick, any questions, at the end, these teachers were like weaving them in throughout their lessons to really get a read on their students.
Totally. And by watching hours of classroom footage, like seriously, they analyzed all these conversations and they noticed these patterns, which they called IFA cycles.
IFA cycles. Oh.
Yeah, and they found 3 main types: connected, non-connected, and repeating.
3 types of informal assessment cycles. Right, I'm ready. Hit me with the first one. What's a connected cycle?
Okay, so connected cycles. This is like the gold standard, right? This is where the teacher asks the question, the student responds, and here's the magic. The teacher actually builds on that response for the next question or to explain something. It creates this really cool flow,
So it's not just about like checking a box. It's about using what the student said as a jumping off point.
Yeah.
This is making me think about all those times I've just said, good job, and moved on.
Right. And they have this great example in the study of a connected cycle in action. Imagine like a classroom. They're talking about genetics, which, can be tough.
Yeah, for sure.
So the teacher asks, what traits won't get passed on through generations? And this one student, Mike, he goes all in, explains dominant and recessive genes, even brings up Mendel.
Whoa. Mike came ready to play. He brought the Mendel knowledge.
Right, so here's where it gets good. Instead of the teacher just being like, good job, Mike, she goes, whoa, Dr. Mendel is back. What do y'all think? Did you get what Mike was saying?
Okay, see what they did there?
Yeah.
They took Mike's answer and used it to bring in the rest of the class, like make it relevant to everyone.
Exactly, and then it kept going. Another student chimed in with an example about eye color, and the teacher, she used that to explain how scientists can predict inheritance patterns. That's a connected cycle in its prime.
Okay, that makes total sense. So what's next? Is the next type of cycle as smooth as the connected cycle?
Not quite as satisfying. They called the second type non-connected cycles. This is where the teacher asks, the student responds, the teacher acknowledges, and then kind of veers off in a totally different direction.
Oh, I've totally been there.
Oh.
It's like you're so focused on your lesson plan that you miss the chance to really explore what the student just said.
Totally. And the study, it gives this perfect example. They were looking at a lesson about the immune system. The teacher asked, raise your hand if you've taken antibiotics. And of course, most of the kids raised their hands.
Yeah. Seems like a pretty straightforward question. Did the students not know what antibiotics were or something?
No, they got that part. But instead of asking, what do you remember about how antibiotics work? Or can you tell me about a time you took them? The teacher just jumped right into this pre-planned explanation about antibiotics.
So it was a missed opportunity to make it personal, connect it to the students' own lives.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that later, the teacher even said he wished he had asked the students to explain what antibiotics are. He felt rushed,
Time, the ultimate enemy of good teaching, right? Okay, so we've got connected cycles where you build on what students say, and non-connected cycles where it's kind of like, well, you missed the boat. What's the third kind?
Okay, so the third type, it's called repeating cycles, and it's a bit tricky.
Repeating cycles. Okay.
Yeah, this is where the teacher asks the same question. Maybe they phrase it a little differently, but they ask it a few times, to try to draw out more responses or to get a specific answer.
Repeating cycles. Yeah, I could see how that could be good or bad, depending on how it's done.
You got it. It's all about how the teacher does it. Sometimes repeating the question can be a good way to get everyone involved, especially those kids who might be a little shy,
It's like you're gently nudging the conversation along, not shutting anyone down.
Right. But of course, it could also feel like the teacher is just fishing for the right answer, and that can kill those aha moments.
Oh, yeah, like they've got a script in their head, and they won't budge until the students say it word for word.
Exactly. And you guessed it, the study gives an example of this too. They were looking at this lesson about writing hypotheses. The teacher gave them a scenario about the effects of eating chocolate cake versus vegetable soup on running speed.
Okay, sounds like a delicious experiment.
Right. And he asked them to come up with a hypothesis.
So did they get it? What happened?
Not really. He kept asking, give me a hypothesis, give me a hypothesis. He would change the wording a little, but nobody seemed to be getting what he was looking for.
So what did he do? Did he give him a hint?
He did eventually, but not before, like, repeating the question a bunch of times. Later, he even said he wished he had tried something they called revoicing, basically asking in a totally different way to see if that helped them understand.
Interesting. So even within those repeating cycles, there are different levels of effectiveness. It's not just repeating is good or repeating is bad. There's an art to it.
Exactly. And that nuance is something that often gets lost in these conversations about teaching, you know?
Totally. So we've talked about these 3 ways teachers use informal assessment in the classroom, but I'm curious, what did the teachers themselves learn from all of this? Did being part of this study change how they thought about these quick check-ins at all?
That's actually one of the coolest parts of this study. It wasn't just about watching what the teachers were doing. It was about understanding how their thinking about these informal assessments evolved over time.
Like the study itself was a kind of informal assessment for them, right?
Yeah.
Like helping them be more mindful of what they were doing in the classroom.
Yeah, for sure. And that's where the really interesting stuff happened. Because at the beginning, like, most of them saw those informal assessments as just these quick little check-ins, you know, make sure everyone's awake. But then as they started looking back at the footage and talking about the different cycles, things started to click. They realized these informal moments, they were actually powerful assessment tools.
Okay, so how did their view change? What was the big aha moment for them?
They realized those quick check-ins could tell them so much about how students were understanding the material, like really making sense of it.
Because you can know the answer, right?
Yeah.
But to explain it in your own words.
Exactly. That's the real test. And through those informal assessments, just from those little questions and observations, these teachers could see how the students were putting everything together, where they were getting tripped up, even how they connected what they were learning to their own lives.
You know, so it became less about can they memorize the textbook and more about can they actually use this information, you know, make it their own.
Exactly. And the teachers even started talking about how informal assessments help them see 3 big things. 1, how students explain things in their own words, like we were saying. 2, if they're thinking critically, not just memorizing.
Because anyone can memorize a definition, right? But can they actually apply it? Can they analyze it? That's the real deal.
Right. And then the third thing they realized was that these informal assessments could show them if students were using good sources of information, which, you know.
Huge these days. Like every student's walking around with like a Library of Alexandria in their pocket.
I know, right? So how do you even keep up with that?
Exactly.
Well, that's where it gets really interesting. Because the teachers talked about how they would have these moments where a student would mention something they saw online, and instead of just going with it, they would use those informal assessment skills to dig a little deeper.
Oh, interesting. So it became less about just giving them the right answer and more about teaching them how to figure it out for themselves.
Exactly. It was all about asking things like, where'd you hear that? Or what makes you think that source is legit?
Like teaching them how to spot fake news before it, you know, takes over the world.
Exactly. It's about being a critical consumer of information. And that's something we all need, right? Not just students, all of us.
Yeah, for sure. So these informal assessments, these quick check-ins, they're like a superpower. But I'm guessing it's not always easy to pull off. What were some of the challenges they talked about?
Yeah, they were really honest about the challenges, which I appreciated.
What were some of the things that made it hard for them to really nail those informal assessments?
Well, this first one won't come as a shock. Time. Even with 2 teachers in the classroom, they still felt that pressure to get through every...
It's like trying to have a deep conversation at the gym, you know?
Yeah.
Like you're trying to get your workout in and reflect on life at the same time.
Totally. And even when they did have time for those deeper conversations, they ran into another challenge, which was their own knowledge base.
Oh, interesting. How so? Were the students stumping them?
Sometimes, yeah. You know, a student would ask something they hadn't anticipated, and they had to think on their feet, which is tough.
Oh, totally. And in that moment, what do? Do you admit you don't know and risk losing your teacher card? Or do you try to steer them back to something you do know?
I know, right? Tough call. They also talked about this other challenge, and it's something anyone who's ever led a discussion or even just been in a group chat can relate to.
Okay, now you've got to tell me. What is it?
They called it the authority of knowledge issue.
Authority of knowledge.
Yeah.
Sounds kind of intense.
It's not quite that dramatic, but it is something to watch out for. Basically, they noticed that sometimes you'd get one student who emerges as the expert in the room.
Oh yeah, the one who always has their hand up, knows all the answers.
Yeah.
Might even correct the teacher sometimes.
Yeah.
I mean, it's great they're engaged, but I can see how that could throw things off.
Totally. And while it's awesome to have those students, the teachers said it could sometimes discourage the others from participating.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Especially if you're shy or still figuring things out. Why speak up if you think your answer won't be as good, you know?
That's exactly what they were struggling with. How do you create this environment where everyone feels comfortable sharing, even if they're not totally sure or if their answer is a little messy?
Because sometimes those messy answers are the ones that lead to the best breakthroughs.
Yes, and these teachers, they knew that, so they started doing things a little differently.
Okay, how so? How did they navigate that authority of knowledge thing?
One thing was being really intentional about who they called on.
So not just the first hand that shoots up.
Right. They'd say things like, let's hear from someone we haven't heard from yet, or what do you think about that student's name?
I love that.
Yeah.
It's subtle, but it sends the message that everyone's voice matters.
Totally. And it wasn't just about who they called on. It was also about how they responded to those students who were dominating the conversation.
Okay, so what did they do? Did they just kind of ignore them?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
They still wanted to acknowledge those contributions, but they tried to shift the focus from being right to the process of thinking, you know?
I like that.
Yeah, they'd ask things like, okay, interesting thought, but tell me how you got there. Or, I see where you're coming from, but what's the evidence for that?
So it was about encouraging them to, think about their own thinking.
Exactly. And by doing that, it subtly changed the whole vibe of the classroom.
Yeah.
It showed everyone that it wasn't about always having the right answer. It was about being part of the conversation, part of the learning process.
Which is a pretty good lesson for life in general, right? Nobody has all the answers. It's about being curious, asking questions, and being open to new ideas.
I couldn't agree more. And it all starts with those little interactions, you know, the ones that happen in classrooms, at home, really anywhere people are learning and growing together.
So we've talked about the benefits of those informal assessments, those different cycles, and some of the challenges, but what does this all mean for you, the listener? What can you take away from all this, and what does any of this have to do with chocolate cake? We'll explore all of that and more after a quick break. So you're telling me we can't have our cake and eat it too? Where does all of this tie back to chocolate cake? And how do we use all of this to survive this crazy world of information overload?
Well, remember that challenge the teachers were talking about? The one about limitless information? That's where the cake comes in, or more like where it doesn't.
Right. When we were talking about those repeating cycles, it was like the teacher kept trying to steer everyone towards one specific answer about the cake instead of letting the students come up with their own ideas.
And that all ties back to this challenge about information overload. The teachers felt this pressure to have all the right answers, especially when students were talking about things they found online.
Which is impossible these days, right? It's like trying to boil the ocean.
Exactly. And that's why those informal assessment skills are so important now more than ever. And not just for teachers, but for all of us.
What do you mean?
Yeah.
You're saying we should all become informal assessment ninjas in our daily lives?
Think about it. For these teachers, it was about trying to help students make sense of a world where information is everywhere, coming at them from all sides.
And not all of it's accurate.
Exactly. So it doesn't matter if you're a teacher, a parent, a student, or just a human being trying to figure things out. The ability to ask good questions, to really listen to the answers, and to figure out what's reliable, those skills are like gold.
So it's not just about memorizing facts anymore.
Mm-hmm.
It's about knowing where to find information, how to filter through everything, and how to decide what to believe.
Exactly. And it's about making sure the next generation knows how to do that too, so they don't get lost in all the noise.
We need to give them the tools to thrive in a world that's changing so fast. It's like we're giving them a compass instead of a map.
I love that. Because things are always changing. But if you know how to think critically, if you can stay curious and be open to new ideas, you'll always be able to find your way.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into informal assessment, what's the one thing you want to leave our listeners with?
It's simple, but it makes a world of difference. Those everyday moments we have, the quick questions, the off-the-cuff responses, those little interactions, those are the moments when we can really learn and grow if we're paying attention.
It's about recognizing how powerful those informal moments can be. Those little exchanges can spark some really big aha moments.
Exactly. Next time you're about to ask a question, take a second to think about it. Whether you're in a meeting, dinner with your family, or even just thinking to yourself, ask yourself, what am I really hoping to learn here? How can I use this to understand things better?
It's about approaching every conversation with curiosity and being open to where it might lead.
Perfectly said. And on that note, I think we've done our deep dive for today.
That's a wrap. Thanks for joining us. And remember, you don't need a fancy title or a research study to be an informal assessment pro. Keep those minds engaged and those questions coming.